What's going on, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Fulton's Music Reviews. Now, before the year officially comes to a close, and before I start to release my year-end top lists, I thought it was time for one last album review. Now, this is a review of an album that was among one of my most requested albums to review back when I started this channel earlier this year, as well as one of my most anticipated releases of 2012, if not my most anticipated release of this year. And the album that we're talking about tonight is, of course, Clockwork Angels from the one and only Rush. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with Rush, they are the infamous Canadian progressive rock trio, and they released Clockwork Angels on June 12th this year on Roadrunner Records here in the US and Anthem Records in Canada, and is the band's 19th studio album. 19. Yeah, I can't really comprehend that either. But once again, Nick Raskulinecz, along with the band, produced this record, and was a continuation of the Caravan single / mini EP, which was released back in June of 2010. The rest of Clockwork Angels took about another 2 years to complete, but the finished product finally made its way into our ears here in 2012, so let's dive into what makes Clockwork Angels so damn good. Now, the first thing you notice about Clockwork Angels the second that you pop this into your CD player is the production. As soon as the steam engine starts to chime at the beginning of this album, you know instantly that this album is going to be huge. And it absolutely is. This album has very, very rich and layered production. A little bit like Vapor Trails, you might say, but with a lot more clarity. Vapor Trails was a very dense album, but it had a very, very harsh kind of sound and a very harsh mix. This album does not have that whatsoever. The mix and engineering on this album is top-notch. Every instrument and every player on this album is heard just perfect in the mix. Very great balance, very warm-sounding record, but just an immense amount of clarity. Not to mention the inclusion of the strings and the orchestra on all of these tracks. Very tastefully done, and just adds to the massivity and the dimension of this album. The second thing you'll notice about this album, if you happen to be a longtime fan of the band, is its retro sound. But it's done in sort of a modern way with sort of a modern edge. Now, Nick Raskulinecz is a huge Rush fan, and as soon as he was asked to come on board to produce the band's previous album, Snakes and Arrows, the fans got really excited because he made it known that he was trying to push the band to sort of go back to their earlier roots and try to bring back some of that earlier energy and sort of give a little bit of a throwback to some of their early material. That's exactly what they did on Snakes and Arrows, but even more so on Clockwork Angels. Tons and tons of throwbacks to the early 70s material. La Villa Strangiato finds its way into some of the riffs in Caravan. Bastille Day finds its way into the riffs of Headlong Flight. In fact, even the band likes to call it Bastille Day 2.0. And aside from the earlier musical motifs and the 70s throwbacks, we also see the return of the massive, bluesy, pentatonic riffs from Alex Lifeson. Now, this is something that Rush fans have sort of realized that he's sort of done away with a little bit on the last several albums, but here we get those big riffs coming back in songs like The Anarchist and Seven Cities of Gold, which hark back to songs from Hemispheres, such as the title track or even the main riff in the song Circumstances. And hearing some of that certainly made me extremely happy, because it really sounded like the band was channeling that 70s nature in the purest form that they possibly could. Another thing you'll notice about Clockwork Angels is the loose, live, and jammy feel that some of these songs have. Now, Clockwork Angels was an album that was finished being written while they were on tour. And on that tour, which happened to be the Time Machine tour from 2010 into 2011, they started experimenting with a little bit more improvisation in some of the songs, especially during a lot of the solo sections. Now, this idea of improvisation definitely spilled into some of the writing of these tracks, and that's definitely apparent on songs like Caravan, the title track Clockwork Angels, Seven Cities of Gold, and of course Headlong Flight. And since the band had just got off the tour prior to going into the studio to record Clockwork Angels, each member of this band was absolutely on fire. and so on top of their game. I'm not saying that they're playing the best that they've ever played, but this is definitely the most on top of their game that I've ever heard them before going into the studio to record an album. And it definitely adds to the energy that you hear on all of these tracks. And last but not least, probably the biggest defining aspect of Clockwork Angels is, of course, the storyline. Now, Clockwork Angels is the band's first official concept record. Now, I know that might cause a little bit of a controversy, considering that many fans of the band consider albums such as 2112, or even albums such as Hemispheres to be concept albums, mainly based around the idea of the side-long epics that both of those albums happen to contain. But this is the first time that the band has released a concept album on a track-to-track basis, stretching throughout the entire course of the album. Now, although each individual track kind of tells its own separate story, they are all unified as a whole based around the Clockwork Angels concept. Now, the Clockwork Angels concept is very much inspired by texts such as The Anarchist by Joseph Conrad and, of course, Voltaire's Candide, classic. And loosely, the main storyline of Clockwork Angels revolves around a clockwork universe powered by the all-knowing, all-powerful Watchmaker. And there is a main character who is taught that everything is for the best and has to go all of these treacherous and painful perils to see if in the end he still has a very optimistic mindset, very much like the main storyline in Candide. And this is a storyline that almost anyone can relate with. In fact, even the band put themselves into some of the songs, especially songs such as Headlong Flight. And not only is this concept extremely relatable and extremely huge, there is also the accompanying novel written by Kevin J. Anderson that was released this past September. I still have yet to check that out, but I definitely plan to check that out very, very soon. Now, although Rush happen to be my favorite band of all time, and I'm probably coming across as such an uber fanboy in this review, that doesn't mean that Clockwork Angels goes without its flaws. I definitely have some slight criticisms about this album, and the first of which is the mastering. All too often these days we hear albums with such great mixes and brilliant engineering just destroyed by the mastering. Now, although this album isn't nearly as bad as, let's say, Vapor Trails, there are definitely some moments where there's some peaking and clipping issues. Some of the main riffs in Headlong Flight, as well as the closing climax in The Garden, definitely have some peaking issues. And as I said, it's definitely not terrible, it's definitely just something I wish wasn't there. And the last slight criticism I have about this album deals with some of the flow of the tracks, mainly dealing with the Brought Up to Believe duality. Now, I kind of feel that the introduction found on the full album version as opposed to the Caravan digital single version didn't really need to be there. I think it sort of broke up the flow a little bit going into the main riff of the song, as well as the Brought Up to Believe Part 2 that happens right before the closing finale of the album. I really didn't think that those introductions were all that necessary, and probably would have been well suited as the reverse pre-roll tracks that some albums had back in the early 90s, but all in all, the flow of the album isn't too bad with those being there, but I kind of wish that, you know, they were a little bit of a pre-roll track. You can never underestimate the power of a pre-roll track, but all in all, this album has a tremendous flow to it overall, and overall an album that is quite honestly the best effort this band has put out since Moving Pictures, and an album with an absolutely fantastic storyline full of memorable songs, memorable melodies. The playing is absolutely phenomenal. This band is clearly a band who just does not want to age, and they are just not willing to give up the torch that they have so proudly held all of these years. Not to mention, this is quite possibly the biggest bang that they could possibly go out on. I really don't know if the band plans to do another record after this, after their Clockwork Angels tour, but if this happens to be the last and final Rush album, I'd be pretty satisfied with that. This is an album that is just an instant classic here in 2012, a landmark achievement for the band, and an album that is highly recommended, and an album that I will garnish with a 9.6 out of 10. And that's going to do it for this final album review here in 2012. I highly recommend you pick up this album. And until next time, please like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you next time with